Okay, thanks very much. So the title for my talk today is The Moral Duty to Learn, Uncertainty, Research, and Novel Disease. I start with a disclosure that I have no conflicts of interest relevant to the content of this talk. And I don't want it to be a mystery, so I want to start with the central claim, what I have as sort of my takeaway message for you. And that is that I think that without a duty to learn, the duty of beneficence can be self-defeating. And the duty of beneficence is sort of the cornerstone of the doctor-patient relationship. So healthcare professionals require better ethical guidance for effective, efficient, and responsible management of uncertainty. And so I will use some events from the current pandemic to illustrate some of these points. So that's where we're going. That's the destination. That's the key takeaway from the talk. So I'm going to start just by talking a little bit about the current doctor-patient relationship, or the conception of the physicians. Really, the key idea that the current conception of the physician's moral responsibilities are very similar to what they were in the Hippocratic, ancient Greece 2,000 years ago. I want to look at some of the core commitments in public statements of professional ethics, and the way in which those pronouncements provide indirect guidance for the way that clinicians might respond to uncertainty, and how that indirect guidance, if it isn't corrected by more explicit directives, can perpetuate a set of self-defeating practices. And so I'll illustrate then what those self-defeating practices are by problems that we've seen during the pandemic response. And then I'll end with some recommendations for improvement. Okay, so let's think about the ethical norms that structure the role of the physician, right? Contemporary medical ethics has certainly introduced changes into our conception of what the ethical responsibilities of a physician are, but the core of those ethical duties remains largely unchanged from the classical period. This is that you are an independent expert, that you have a dyadic relationship with a patient, that the core of your moral relationship to your patient is that you will use your independent judgment to put the patient interest first. You'll maintain a consultative relationship with your colleagues, and you'll be a good member of the larger profession. And the cornerstone of this ancient idea is that you'll use your knowledge and ability to benefit the patient. And so you can see that here. I don't expect you to read the whole thing, but this is the one version of the Hippocratic Oath, and the key point is down here. I've illustrated in red, right, that I'll use those dietary regimens which will benefit my patients according to my greatest ability and my judgment, and I will do no harm or injustice to them. So sort of the beneficence here as sort of the moral cornerstone of the physician's duties. Now, of course, the ancient conception of the physician's moral responsibilities had this potential for excess, and so it was the correcting this potential for excess that was one of the early and most lasting contributions of medical ethics. So the Hippocratic duty to advance patient interests was taken to justify coercion or deception, or cajoling the patient, as long as it was directed at the good of the patient. So this was really an ethic that was a patient-centered consequentialism. It was consequentialism in the sense that the right act was supposed to be the one that would bring about the most good, but it was patient-centered because instead of the good being defined as the good of society as a whole, the good was defined as the good of the particular patient. So the idea in this sort of older conception of what the physician's moral duties were was to perform the action that would bring about the best outcomes for the individual patient. Now, contemporary medical ethics as an independent area of scholarship, one of its main contributions was to reform the paternalism that was latent in this approach. So what do I mean by paternalism? Paternalism was the idea that the physician could circumscribe the liberty or constrain the liberty of the patient as long as they were doing so for the patient's own good. And the problem with that was that there was a knowledge deficit. So interestingly, the early reforms of medical ethics, of the professional ethics of medicine that were brought about by medical ethics, was to identify a deficit in clinician knowledge that needed to be rectified. And here the deficit was that we couldn't assume that physicians would know the place of health in their patient's larger life plan. And so it was a critique of the assumption that health was necessarily the patient's highest value. Without that assumption, then we needed a more collaborative relationship where there was the sharing of information between doctors and patients in order to ascertain where health would fall within the larger plan of a patient, and then to work out a course of care that would reflect proper concern for health, but also the larger values of patients. It also reflected this independent value of self-determination, so that even if one makes some mistakes, there's still value in making decisions for oneself. And so the upshot of these reforms was a duty to engage in a supportive relationship with patients to support their autonomy and facilitate the ability of patients to make their own decisions. So in a certain sense, the reason why I sort of focused on this is that the fundamental duty remains. The fundamental duty of the ancient Hippocratic tradition remains. It's just now the duty to use your expert knowledge to advance the interests of the patient is circumscribed by the duty to inform patients of all the relevant medical facts and to support their autonomy so that they can make decisions for themselves. So it's still a kind of patient-centered consequentialism. It's just now circumscribed within the idea that that consequentialist calculus has to be informed by the patient's values and the way that they understand health within a larger conception of their life plan or conception of the good life. So we see this in updated codes of medical ethics. So this is the WMA's International Code of Medical Ethics, which is currently under revision. And so you get things here like the physician shall always exercise his or her independent professional judgment and maintain the highest standards of professional conduct, respect competent patients' rights to accept or refuse treatment. So this is a important new addition. Allow his or her judgment to be influenced, not allow his or her judgment to be influenced by personal profit or unfair discrimination. Dedicated to providing competent medical services in full professional and moral independence with compassion and respect for human dignity. So here's still sort of the remaining core from previous documents. Okay. And then, of course, you get the other aspects as well in terms of consultation and being a good member of the profession. But here again, acting in the patient's best interest when providing medical care. So that moral duty is unchanged. And you owe, a physician shall owe his or her patient complete loyalty with all the scientific resources available to him or her. So whenever an examination or treatment is beyond the physician's capacity, what do? Well, then you should consult with or refer to another physician who has the necessary ability. Okay, so if you take these documents as being the public pronouncements of what the public can expect from physicians, and that physicians internalize about what their duties are, to their patients, it basically says use your expert knowledge to advance the health of the patients as those patients understand it. When you lack that knowledge or information, consult with your peers. What about this situation now? What do we do when there's a novel pathogen? When there's insufficient understanding of the pathophysiology of the disease or the mechanism of intervention action, where there is scant or confounded empirical evidence about intervention effects, and when there is conflicting expert opinion about what the optimal course of care is. What should we do now in this situation? Well, given the core values that we were just reviewing, well, it seems like the core pronouncements of medical ethics presume what we'll call epistemic closure. That is the idea that we have available to us somewhere the information, the knowledge that we need in order to carry out our duties to our patients. And so you could see this in the quote from the WMA document: whenever an examination or treatment is beyond the physician's capacity, he or she should consult with or refer to another physician who has the necessary ability. So this is the idea of epistemic closure here. The presumption is somebody has the ability, consult with them and find them. So if we rely on these statements of, what our core responsibilities are, they're to be a good colleague, ask around, right? Form an all things considered assessment of what is likely to be best, and then act in the best interest of the patient, consistent with respect for patient autonomy. So consistent with respect for patient autonomy is the sort of the innovation, the change from contemporary medical ethics, but the rest of this is largely unchanged from the ancient Hippocratic tradition. Okay, so the recipe now, so this is a recipe for taking a very particular approach to the situation I described where there's uncertainty. So this is from an older paper by Enkin. It says an ethical physician must do what is best for his or her patients. She cannot participate in a controlled trial if she is certain that one arm is superior to the others and that some of her patients will receive an inferior treatment by participating in the trial. It doesn't matter whether her certainty is based on formal scientific studies or personal experience, on anecdote or tacit understanding or rules of thumb. Whether her certainty is in accord with or diverges from the view of the medical community is irrelevant, because remember, there's this duty to be an independent expert. Uncertainty is a moral prerequisite for a controlled study. If we know what we should do it and not study it. So all of the statements that you see here, you could see how they could be derived relatively easily from the guidance that we just went through. You have to be an independent expert, use the information that's available to advance the interests of your patient. And why should the pedigree of that information matter, so long as you regard it as being have sufficient probative value that it tells you this, that you form an all things considered preference for one intervention over others. So we see this idea resurface in crisis situations, mostly because a lot of people regard crisis situations as having a particular exigency to them that is somehow not present in non-crisis situations, even though every non-crisis situation in medicine, we're dealing with patients who are very often going to die from the disease that, with patients who have very severe diseases, and for, where they could die from those diseases or suffer severe disability as a result, or injury or harm. So the idea that RCTs are inconsistent with individual clinicians' duty of care in crisis situations, illustrated in the 2014-2015 Ebola outbreak in West Africa. Adebamuwo and colleagues say equipoise. So this equipoise is the idea that it's okay to randomize as long as there's sufficient uncertainty about which of the interventions a patient might receive. So they say that's a useful principle, but it can break down when conventional care offers little benefit and mortality is extremely high. We already saw in Enkin. Enkin is basically saying, well, that kind of uncertainty is going to be pretty rare, because if you have any evidence that leads you to prefer one intervention over the other, then you have a duty to, as an independent expert, to provide your patients with that intervention. And then we see this in a quote here from Dieter Raut, who conducted one of the early studies of hydroxychloroquine in the SARS-CoV-2 pandemic. And so in this interview with the New York Times, he says, we're not going to tell someone, listen, today's not your lucky day, you're getting the placebo, you're going to be dying. Dieter Raut told me, so this is the reporter writing, he believes it to be unnecessary, in addition to being unethical, to run randomized controlled trials, or RCTs, of treatments for deadly infectious diseases. So in this interview with the New York Times, here you're basically getting the idea that it contravenes the duties of the clinician to allow a patient to be randomized to a placebo, even though in the early days of the SARS-CoV-2 outbreak, this is a novel pathogen where we have very little evidence about the efficacy of any of the interventions that were supported by some theoretical underpinning. Okay, so my view is that what we just went through is the moral equivalent of this kind of dumpster fire, in the sense that so it's this view that I want to criticize. It's this view that I think produces self-defeating practices. So my claim is going to be it's bad for patients, it's bad for physicians, it's bad for medicine. So what are these self-defeating practices? So at the beginning of the pandemic, there were many promising interventions. I won't read you the whole list. There were about a dozen interventions on this list. And some experts regarded each of these as good ideas, backed by some sort of understanding of the early understanding of the pathophysiology of the virus and some mechanism of action for the intervention. So some experts would regard it as a duty to provide one of these, call it A. Others would regard it as a duty to provide another one of these, B, all the way through N, where N is the number of interventions. And so as a result, then in actual clinical practice, you'd have, if we didn't carry out research, if we acted on the advice of Enkin or Rout, you'd have some patients receiving A, some patients receiving B, all the way to N. But of course, in a context in which it's very difficult to learn whether anything works, because there's all the confounding and bias that we get from physician-selected treatment without blinding in a regular treatment context. So if there are N treatment groups, so just take a simple example, if there were as many physicians as treatment and each favored one of these interventions, then each clinician would regard it as their duty to provide something that a supermajority of their peers regarded as suboptimal, right? Each clinician would say, I'm duty bound to provide this intervention. And then every other clinician would say, well, I think that's the wrong thing to do. Now, so the part of the problem here is that it's easy to form a preference early on the basis of initial evidence and background theory. But you have to keep in mind most novel interventions or interventions for novel conditions don't work. 9 out of every 10 new drugs fails to win approval for any indication. And FDA approval is a kind of permissive standard because there are all kinds of interventions that are tried for all kinds of drugs that are tried for one indication and then wind up receiving approval for something different. Latisse, for instance, is a treatment for the debilitating condition of anemic eyelashes. It was not developed for that indication, but giving people fuller and lusher eyelashes was sort of a side effect of what I believe was a glaucoma drug in the beginning. So that drug is approved for an indication, even though it didn't succeed at the indication for which it was initially trialed. In other areas, in neuroprotective agents or interventions for neurodegenerative diseases like Alzheimer's and Parkinson's, nothing works. And so our failure rates are about 100%. And even when we have supportive positive phase 1 data and supportive and positive phase 2 data, so we've seen, not only do we have theories that these interventions are going to work, and we have promising early phase data, about half of what we try, half the interventions that we try fail in phase 3. So the position that I'm critiquing can be morally corrosive because it severs the connection between therapeutic intent and therapeutic effect. And the cornerstone of allopathic medicine, what separates it from the hucksters and liniment and tonic salespeople is that the warrant for therapeutic intent is to be grounded in actual evidence of therapeutic effect. So without that, if we don't have convincing evidence of therapeutic effect, what remains? Just the assertion of professional power and authority, unmoored from the foundation that gives it legitimacy, namely that there's some discretion to use professional judgment to advance the health interests of patients, but without evidence that that's what you're doing, you just have unmoored professional authority. So imagine that you have a really motivated patient. This is a thought experiment now. I'm not saying this could happen. I'm saying think about what the consequences of this would be in terms of our justification to these patients. If we had as many patients as there were experts and as many experts as there were drugs, and each patient could seek, go to an expert and say, well, what would you do for me, given that I have this novel coronavirus? And each would make a recommendation. But if they each make different recommendations, now each expert thinks that what the other experts are doing is suboptimal. But each patient has the authority, legitimate ability to seek like a second opinion and nth opinion. And then what should they do? They've been given conflicting advice now by each of the N experts that they've seen. They could flip a coin, right? They could arbitrarily say, well, I want to go see this guy because this guy went to, is professor at Wake Forest. So, this guy's got to be really smart. Maybe they were like, oh, well, I went to University of Pittsburgh and this guy's University of Pittsburgh. So I want to go see that. So they could use some arbitrary method for making a decision, but they could also flip a coin. But it'd be really strange to say that it'd be morally permissible in the face of conflicting expert opinion for patients to decide who should give them their care by flipping a coin. It'd be really weird to then say, but it would be unethical for each of these physicians to flip a coin to decide what care these patients would receive. But that's the position that effectively I think Enkin is advocating, and that's the position that would follow from if all we did was take the recommendations of traditional statements of physicians' moral obligations. So that situation then, if what we said was, well, physicians can't participate in this process, that would be a vestige of paternalism now, because now you would be restricting participation in RCTs for no good reason, right? Patients could arbitrarily choose which physician to provide their care, but if you wouldn't then allow them the option of participating in an RCT where a coin would be flipped to determine which intervention they would receive, then you'd be restricting the liberty of patients from contributing to the common good, right? Generating the information we need in order to find out which of these interventions actually works. And moreover, in doing that, they would not incur any personal sacrifice. So, because they're not going to be treated inside the trial any differently than they would be outside the trial if they went to any one of these physicians. Once they flip a coin and they're like, oh, you go to see physician number 2. If they went to see physician number 2 outside the trial, their treatment would be the same. So it makes nobody better off. Let's say restricting patients from being in these studies makes nobody better off and makes a lot of stakeholders worse off, because it deprives the health systems, patients, and providers of the information they need to translate therapeutic intent into therapeutic effect. So, this is the sense in which then this would be a self-defeating practice, because in a randomized clinical trial, some patients are going to receive, each of the particular treatments, and others aren't, which is exactly the same situation we have if we don't run the trial and we allow these experts to act on their expert professional judgment. Moreover, then in the trial, given that there's this background of uncertainty and disagreement, each person in the trial receives an intervention that would be recommended for them by at least a reasonable minority of informed experts. So there's nobody in the trial who's being allocated to a standard of care that falls below what at least a reasonable minority would recommend for them. But randomization creates the conditions that control for confounding and promote reliable learning. So if we refuse to conduct randomized controlled trials, we make nobody better off, and we leave many stakeholders worse off. So there are real world consequences to whether we run these trials, whether we do so quickly and expeditiously. So the United States distributed 31 million doses of hydroxychloroquine from the strategic stockpile, which at the time of this article was published still contained 63 million doses of hydroxychloroquine and 2 million doses of chloroquine. The rush to procure this drug and to provide it to patients with COVID-19 produced shortages of the drug for America's 1.5 million patients with lupus, where these drugs are actually established effective treatments with FDA-approved treatments for that autoimmune disorder. Moreover, allowing physicians to act on therapeutic intent without clear evidence of benefit can result in making patients worse off. So the recovery trial in the UK quickly randomized patients to a variety of interventions, one of which was hydroxychloroquine. And the published report from recovery says, among patients hospitalized with COVID-19, those who received hydroxychloroquine did not have a lower incidence of death at 28 days than those who received usual care, and that such patients had a longer duration of hospitalization. And among those who are not in need of mechanical ventilation at baseline, the number of patients who had progression to the pre-specified composite secondary outcome of invasive mechanical ventilation or death was higher among those in the hydroxychloroquine group than among those in the usual care group. So this original study that was carried out, that was non-randomized, launched 1,000 ships, as it were. So we had 1,200 studies launched early on. 1 in 6 was a study of hydroxychloroquine. Of the 685,000 anticipated participants, 35% or 237,000 were to be enrolled in studies of hydroxychloroquine. Yet when we look at the quality, so you might say, well, wait a minute, you're saying there's a reluctance to run these studies, but look, there's a land rush of studies that are being carried out. And part of the problem was, yeah, Rout ran a study. He just didn't run a high quality, double-blind, randomized, placebo-controlled trial because he regarded that as being unethical, because he thought that hydroxychloroquine was more likely to confer clinical benefit than placebo. Now, we have pretty solid reason to believe post hoc that he was wrong, but that's not the key. The key is, at the time, what evidence did he have, and should that evidence have been persuasive? Would it have been irresponsible for some clinicians not to provide their patients with hydroxychloroquine? I think the answer to that was no, it would not have been irresponsible. And so that means we're back in the situation that I gave you in our toy example. Some patients who would go to receive care from clinicians would receive hydroxychloroquine, others wouldn't. So it would have been perfectly fine, perfectly ethical to randomize, just as the recovery trial did, patients to receive hydroxychloroquine or a placebo. And so, we ran these studies, or many groups initiated these studies, but in a review of many of these studies, the reviewers say, even before results are known, most studies likely will not yield meaningful scientific evidence at a time when rapid generation of high quality knowledge is critical. So we had a proliferation of low quality studies. Of the roughly 1,500 studies for COVID-19, only 238 planned enrollment of more than 100 participants. 640 or 41% were observational studies. So, these studies that have very few participants, they're looking for silver bullets. They're looking for something that has a penicillin effect. And of course, very few interventions that have a meaningful clinical benefit have a benefit that's that big. We see this in other domains too. So there's a systematic review of 25 mental health studies that were carried out during COVID-19. There were 0 pre-registered study designs, preliminary outcomes, and analysis plans. 7% included, only 7% included a priori power analysis. 10% used random sampling methods or recruitment for participation. So part of the worry here is that people think, well, some evidence now is better than nothing. And our position is some evidence now can be worse than no evidence if the evidence that you generate is misleading, because you can shift practice behavior without proper warrant. You can shift patient preferences without evidence of benefit. That doesn't make patients better off. So you can have patients and clinicians now persuaded that hydroxychloroquine or convalescent plasma is a really, really good option. So they can change their preferences. They can also, makes it harder to recruit people into the studies that would actually answer these questions about the relative clinical merits of these interventions. And so you don't make patients better off. You don't make an efficient use of resources, because you delay the amount of time, you prolong the amount of time that we're providing these interventions of questionable clinical value, and you delay the time to the completion of studies that will tell us whether these things actually work. So the focus on this individual duty of care, unmoored from a duty to carry out the research that will provide the evidence to know whether your therapeutic intent translates into therapeutic effect, obscures the social nature of uncertainty or disagreement. Focusing on the individual clinician, what the individual clinician thinks obscures the social nature of uncertainty or disagreement, and the social role of research in generating the evidence that's necessary for a wide range of stakeholders to discharge their moral obligations, right? It isn't just that clinicians have fidelity to their individual patient. Policymakers have to make efficient use of scarce resources, because in a pandemic, when health systems are highly burdened, clinician personnel, time, resources are scarce, and generating the knowledge that we need quickly to know what works and what doesn't allows us to make a more efficient use of those resources. So my suggested revision is that we include this as a duty for caregivers. When experts disagree or are uncertain about the best means of preventing, diagnosing, or treating sickness, injury, or disease, physicians have a duty to support and not to undermine the conduct of scientifically sound and socially valuable medical research. So moreover, that means that we want the studies that we put into the field quickly to have social value. And here are 5 markers that we propose for social value. So they should be important. So they should address key evidence gaps. They should have a rigorous design. And part of that means there should be meaningful effects that are positive or negative. So a study that shows you that a negative effect that's underpowered, or that has a very small, it's only powered to detect a really big effect, tells you something that you probably believed going in, namely there's not a penicillin size effect here. And so if it's still possible that there's a smaller, but what would be clinically meaningful effect, then that may not be an appropriate design, because it hasn't removed enough of the residual uncertainty. It's important that there's analytical integrity, so that we have pre-specified designs and analyses, so that we're not reporting findings that are different from the hypotheses that we set out to test. So there should be consistent reporting as well. So it should be clear what was pre-specified, and also it should be clear findings should be placed in the context. So during the COVID outbreak, there was a lot of rushing studies to preprint servers, making pretty significant outsized claims. Once peer review came in and threw cold water on some of those claims, then they would be walked back, but not until they had already made it to the front page, or at least into the pages of the New York Times or something like that. And then finally, there needs to be feasibility. Now, you could say feasibility, the lack of feasibility is why there are all these proliferation of low quality studies. But that's why it's important to recognize that there's this duty, because part of the duty is to cooperate and collaborate so that we can pool resources in order to get good quality studies off the ground and completed in a timely manner. And one way to do that is to use the kind of multi-center adaptive designs that we see in trials like Recovery. So in my book, I go even further. I say that there's a strong social imperative to promote the ability of communities to create, sustain, and engage in research understood as a scheme of social cooperation that respects the status of its stakeholders as free and equal, and it functions to generate the information and the interventions that are needed to enable the basic social systems of their community to equitably, effectively, and efficiently safeguard and advance the basic interests of their constituent members. So that's a lot, but that's just sort of a preview of even the larger claim that I make. So here in this talk, what I'm saying is there's this limited duty. I'm defending the idea that there's a duty to, in the face of this kind of uncertainty, to carry out this research. But I think this is an instance of a much larger duty to make sure that we're providing a much more significant level of support for the research enterprise as providing the foundation for the evidence we need in allopathic medicine to discharge our duties to patients. So in conclusion, I want to say that research is and should be embraced as a responsible means of responding to uncertainty. It provides access to potential interventions to patients who are in need, but it does so under conditions that control for confounding. And so initiating those studies early on in the pandemic allows us to sort the wheat from the chaff, avoid providing interventions that don't work at a large scale to patients, and focus our efforts and our resources on interventions that provide some kind of therapeutic benefit. In the presence of clinical equipoise, no participant receives a level of care that falls below what would be recommended for them by at least a reasonable minority of expert clinicians. So in the presence of this condition, it is not the case that having a participant enrolled in a study makes them worse off than they would be if they were not enrolled in the study. And it quickly generates the evidence that clinicians, health systems, policymakers need to discharge their important social responsibilities. So the key claim I want you to take away is that physicians have a duty to promote health systems that update patient care based on new medical evidence in a timely manner, to coordinate practices and promote effective and efficient care, and provide health services with equity. And the foundation for all of that is a duty to learn, to generate the evidence that we need to fulfill these obligations. Thanks, and I look forward to our conversation.